The desert wind whipped across the dunes of Tunisia, carrying the stinging grit of sand into the eyes of men who had once believed they were invincible. It was May 1943, and the silence that fell over the North African front was heavier than the roar of artillery that had preceded it. Hans, a 20-year-old corporal in the Afrika Korps, stood with his hands raised above his head. His uniform was tattered, bleached almost white by the relentless sun, and his canteen had been empty for 2 days. He trembled, not just from exhaustion, but from a deep, primal fear instilled in him by years of indoctrination. He looked into the barrel of a weapon held by a tall, chewing American soldier. Hans closed his eyes, waiting for the end. He had been told 1,000 times by his officers, by the radio, and by the newspapers back home that the Americans were gangsters, lawless cowboys who took no prisoners and respected no rules of war. He expected a bullet, or perhaps the butt of a rifle. Instead, he heard a rustling sound. When he opened his eyes, the American was not aiming at him anymore. The soldier reached into a pouch, pulled out a pack of cigarettes, tossed it to Hans, and gestured for him to move toward the rear. This moment, repeated hundreds of thousands of times across the theaters of World War II, was the first crack in the shattered worldview of the German soldier. It was the beginning of an odyssey that would take hundreds of thousands of men from the battlefields of Europe and Africa to a land that defied their imagination. They were about to embark on a journey to the United States of America, a trip that would serve as a greater counter-argument to National Socialism than any political speech ever could. For these men, the journey into captivity was not a descent into a dungeon, but a bewildering ascent into a land of plenty that seemed physically impossible to their war-weary minds. As we begin to unravel this fascinating chapter of history, where enemies came face to face with a reality that shattered their propaganda-fueled nightmares, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue to bring these forgotten stories to light, and you won't want to miss the incredible details of what happened next. To understand the depth of the shock experienced by German prisoners of war, one must first understand the mental landscape they inhabited before their capture. The Third Reich was a master of information control. Joseph Goebbels and his propaganda machine had painted a very specific, terrifying picture of the United States. The German public and the Wehrmacht soldiers were told that America was a cultural wasteland, a degenerate society crumbling under the weight of racial mixing and Jewish influence. They were told that the American soldier was weak, unmotivated, and incapable of facing the Aryan warrior. Furthermore, as the war turned against Germany, the propaganda became more apocalyptic. Soldiers were warned that surrender meant certain death or enslavement in conditions worse than the Siberian gulags. They were told that American cities were being bombed by the Luftwaffe, that the U.S. economy was collapsing, and that the Amis were on the verge of defeat. When a German soldier surrendered, he was often bracing himself for torture. The reality of the initial processing camps was the first shock. While the frontline holding areas were chaotic and often lacked amenities due to the sheer volume of prisoners, especially after the collapse of the Axis forces in Tunisia, where over 200,000 were taken, the treatment was markedly different from what they expected. They were not lined up and shot. They were counted, searched, and given water. But the true revelation began when they were moved from the temporary cages in North Africa or France to the transport ships waiting at the docks. The logistics of moving an army of prisoners across the Atlantic Ocean was a feat of organization that only the United States could manage at that time. The prisoners were marched up the gangplanks of Liberty ships and troop transports. These were the same vessels that had brought American troops and endless supplies to the European theater. Now, they would return with the enemy. For many German soldiers, this was their first time at sea. As they were herded into the holds of the ships, fear spiked again. They knew better than anyone the effectiveness of the German U-boat wolf packs. For years, they had cheered the news of Allied tonnage sunk in the Atlantic. Now, in a twist of cruel irony, they found themselves praying that their own comrades in the submarines would not spot their ship. They were terrified of being torpedoed by their own side. The conditions on the ships were crowded, often hot and stifling, but they were functional. The prisoners were given bunks or hammocks, but it was the first meal on board that caused the first wave of genuine disbelief. In the German army, especially in the later years, rations were strictly calculated. Black bread, meager stews, ersatz coffee, and limited fats were the norm. On the American transport ships, the prisoners were handed trays piled with white bread, butter, jam, meat, and real coffee. One German prisoner later recalled holding a piece of white bread in his hands and staring at it as if it were gold. White bread was a luxury in Europe, a memory from before the war. Here, on a prison ship, it was served in abundance. The butter was real, not the chemical margarine substitutes they were used to. The coffee smelled like actual beans, not roasted grain. Rumors flew through the holds of the ships. Some prisoners whispered that this was a trick, a Henkersmahlzeit, the last meal of the condemned. They believed they were being fattened up before being executed. Others argued that it was a propaganda stunt, that the Americans were starving their own crews to impress the prisoners. But as the days turned into weeks and the meals continued to arrive with the same quality and quantity, the confusion deepened. The American guards seemed indifferent to the food, treating these luxuries as mundane, everyday occurrences. This casual attitude toward abundance was more unsettling to the Germans than the food itself. The Atlantic crossing was tense. The prisoners spent their days playing cards with homemade decks, organizing lectures among themselves, and staring at the endless horizon. But the greatest shock was yet to come. It waited for them at the end of the voyage, rising out of the mist of the east coast of the United States. Most of the transport ships docked in Boston, Norfolk, or New York City. The arrival in New York Harbor was a psychological turning point that no amount of re-education could ever equal. As the ships glided past the Statue of Liberty and entered the harbor, the German prisoners were allowed on deck. What they saw silenced them. They had been told by the Nazi leadership that the Luftwaffe had rained destruction upon American soil. They expected to see ruins, blackened skeletons of buildings, and a city in blackout, cowering in fear of German bombers. Instead, they saw a metropolis untouched by war. The skyline of Manhattan rose like a mountain range of steel and stone, gleaming in the sun. The buildings were intact. The docks were bustling with an energy and industrial capacity that was terrifying to behold. Ships of every size were being loaded with mountains of crates, tanks, trucks, and planes. But it was the night that truly broke them. In Europe, the blackout was a way of life. Not a single light could be shown for fear of attracting bombers. Entire nations lived in darkness after sunset. In New York, the lights were on. The city blazed with electricity. Neon signs flickered, office windows glowed, and street lights formed ribbons of gold stretching into the distance. The sheer arrogance of a city that did not need to hide in the dark struck the prisoners with the force of a physical blow. One prisoner wrote in his diary that seeing the lights of New York was the moment he realized Germany had lost the war. It was a visual demonstration of untouchability. The enemy was not just far away. The enemy was operating in a different universe, one where fuel and electricity were so cheap and abundant that they could be burned simply to light up the night sky for advertisement. The processing at the American ports was efficient and impersonal. The prisoners were sprayed with DDT to kill lice, given showers, and issued new clothing if their uniforms were disintegrating. The clothing often bore the letters PW stenciled on the back, standing for prisoner of war. Then they were loaded onto trains. If the arrival in New York was a shock, the train journey across the American continent was a lesson in geography and logistics that dismantled the Nazi concept of Lebensraum, or living space. Germany is a relatively small country, densely packed. A train ride across Germany takes hours. The prisoners were loaded into Pullman cars. These were not the cattle cars that Germany used to transport Soviet prisoners or Jewish deportees. These were passenger cars with cushioned seats, windows, and heating. The comfort of the trains was disorienting. The prisoners sat on soft upholstery, looking out at the passing landscape. They traveled for days. They watched the industrial sprawl of the East Coast give way to the endless flatlands of the Midwest, the rolling hills of the South, or the deserts of the Southwest. The sheer size of the United States was incomprehensible. They traveled for 20, 30, 40 hours, and they were still in the same country. They saw endless fields of corn and wheat, vast herds of cattle, and forests that seemed to go on forever. For a soldier raised on the ideology that Germany was suffocating for lack of space and resources, looking out the window at the American landscape was a revelation. They saw no bomb craters. They saw no starving refugees on the roads. They saw shiny automobiles driving on paved highways that ran parallel to the tracks. They saw farmhouses painted and well-maintained. The realization began to sink in. They had declared war on a continent. The trains eventually arrived at their destinations. The United States had built over 600 camps to house the prisoners, scattered across almost every state, though the majority were in the South and Southwest due to the warmer climate, which saved on heating costs. Places like Camp Aliceville in Alabama, Camp Concordia in Kansas, or Camp Hearn in Texas became their new homes. When the prisoners disembarked from the trains, they braced themselves again for the concentration camps they knew existed in Europe. They expected barbed wire, mud, disease, and brutality. They found the barbed wire, certainly, and the guard towers. But what lay inside the wire was another shock. The camps were built to standard U.S. Army specifications. The barracks were wooden, raised off the ground, and heated with stoves. There were mess halls, recreation rooms, infirmaries with modern medical equipment, and latrines that were clean and sanitary. The reception by the camp commanders varied, but it generally followed the strict guidelines of the Geneva Convention. The United States was obsessed with following the rules of war, primarily because they wanted to ensure that American boys held prisoner in Germany would be treated with the same respect. The logic was reciprocity. If the Americans treated German prisoners well, the Germans would have no excuse to mistreat Americans. The German prisoners were organized into companies. They were allowed to keep their rank and their uniforms. They were allowed to govern their own internal affairs to a large degree. But the immediate and most overwhelming impression remained the material abundance. The first meal in the camp mess hall was often the final nail in the coffin of the Nazi propaganda narrative. The prisoners grabbed their metal trays and moved down the line. They were served portions that would have fed a German family for a week. Huge scoops of mashed potatoes with gravy, large cuts of meat, pork chops, steaks, roast beef, vegetables that were not rotting, fresh fruit, and milk. Milk was a critical symbol. In wartime Europe, milk was for babies and the very sick. Here, grown men were given glasses of milk with their lunch. The tables had condiments, salt, pepper, sugar, ketchup. Sugar was rationed so strictly in Germany that it was a currency. Here, it sat in glass shakers on the table, unguarded. The prisoners ate in silence, often looking around to see if the guards were watching, waiting for the punchline of the joke. But the guards were just eating their own food. The Fresswell, the eating wave, began. Prisoners gained weight rapidly. In the first few months of captivity, it was not effective to send photos home because their families would not recognize the healthy, well-fed men in the pictures. Or worse, the families would think the photos were faked. There is a famous anecdote of a German prisoner who asked a guard why they were being fed so well. The guard simply shrugged and said, "We have so much food, we don't know what to do with it." That casual admission of surplus was devastating. The German war machine was fueled by scarcity, by the desperate need to seize resources from the East. The American war machine was fueled by an excess so great that they could afford to feed the enemy better than the enemy could feed its own elite troops. The contrast between the gangsters they were warned about and the men guarding them was also stark. The American guards were generally relaxed. They were not the rigid, heel-clicking disciplinarians of the Prussian tradition. They chewed gum, they leaned against fences, they smoked with their hands in their pockets. They were often curious about the Germans. Instead of hatred, the prisoners often encountered a strange sort of indifference or mild curiosity. The Americans didn't seem to hate them with the fiery, ideological passion that the Nazis had demanded. To the Americans, the Germans were just guys who got caught on the wrong side of the job. This lack of fanaticism was confusing. How could a soldier fight without hate? And yet, these relaxed, gum-chewing Americans had crossed an ocean and smashed the Wehrmacht in North Africa. It didn't make sense to the German military mind. As the first few weeks turned into months, the prisoners settled into a routine that was surreal in its comfort. They slept on mattresses with clean sheets. They had hot showers every day. They were given toiletries, toothbrushes, soap that actually lathered, razors. These small items, the mundane artifacts of daily life, were powerful tools of deprogramming. It is hard to believe that your enemy is a subhuman barbarian when he provides you with high-quality toothpaste and a heated barrack. However, the psychological transition was not immediate for everyone. The camps were microcosms of the Third Reich. Hardcore Nazis, often the non-commissioned officers, NCOs, maintained a grip on the internal politics of the camps. They warned the other prisoners not to be seduced by the American luxury. They claimed it was a golden cage, a trap designed to make them soft and betray the fatherland. They enforced discipline, sometimes brutally, within the barracks. They organized classes to keep the Nazi ideology alive, fearing that the comfort of American life would erode the soldiers' loyalty to Hitler. They were right to be afraid. The erosion was happening with every bite of white bread and every hot shower. The average German soldier, who was not a fanatical party member, but a conscript fighting for his country, could not help but compare his life in the Wehrmacht with his life as a prisoner of the U.S. Army. In the Wehrmacht, he was freezing, hungry, and constantly in danger. As a prisoner in Texas or Oklahoma, he was safe, warm, and better fed than he had ever been in his life. The cognitive dissonance was painful. If the Americans were the weak, degenerate race described by Hitler, how did they build these cities? How did they produce this endless stream of food? How could they afford to treat their enemies like guests? The evidence of their eyes conflicted with the loyalty in their hearts. One of the most striking aspects of the first impressions was the interaction with the American civilian population, even from a distance. Many camps were located near small towns. Prisoners could see cars driving by. They saw women driving, something less common in Germany. They saw the fashion, the lack of uniformity. When they were eventually assigned to labor details, which we will explore deeply later, they came into closer contact with farmers and factory workers. But even in these early days, the sight of the American people was surprising. They didn't look like the downtrodden, racially chaotic mobs of Goebbels' speeches. They looked healthy. They looked prosperous. And disturbingly, they looked happy. The technological superiority was another immediate shock. The trucks that transported them were robust and plentiful. In the German army, by 1943, horses were still the primary method of logistics for many infantry divisions. The Americans seemed to do everything with an engine. Bulldozers, cranes, jeeps, trucks. The mechanization of the American military and society was visible everywhere. The German soldier, who often marched hundreds of miles on foot, watched in awe as the Americans moved everything on wheels. There was also the matter of news. In the camps, prisoners were eventually allowed access to newspapers and radios. At first, they dismissed the American news as propaganda, just as they had dismissed their own. But the American newspapers were different. They reported losses. They criticized the government. They debated strategy. The chaotic, noisy, argumentative nature of the American press was shocking to men used to the synchronized, singular voice of the state-controlled media. They could read about strikes in American factories or political scandals in Washington. This freedom to criticize the leadership while still fighting a war was a concept that was alien and confusing. The first impressions of the German prisoners in America were defined by a crushing realization of scale. The war they had been fighting in Europe felt claustrophobic compared to the vastness of the American continent. The resource disparity was the most undeniable fact of their new existence. They had been taught that will, spirit, and racial purity were the deciding factors in war. In America, they were confronted with the reality that steel, oil, wheat, and meat were forces of nature that no amount of will could overcome. As the initial shock wore off, a new phase began. The prisoners were not just guests, they were a labor source. The United States faced a massive labor shortage as millions of men went overseas to fight. The fields of the Midwest needed harvesting, the canneries needed workers, and the forests needed logging. The millions of idle hands in the POW camps were the solution. This transition from passive bewilderment to active participation in the American economy would bring the German prisoners into the heart of American life, leading to friendships, romances, and a further dismantling of the Nazi ideology. But before they could work, they had to be processed, categorized, and understood by their captors. The Americans were not just feeding them. They were studying them. They were looking for the cracks in the armor of National Socialism, looking for the best way to turn these men from enemies into future allies for a post-war Germany that was yet to be imagined. The story of the German POWs in America is a story of contrasts. It is the contrast between the gray, starving reality of war-torn Europe and the technicolor abundance of the American homefront. It is the contrast between the rigid hierarchy of the Wehrmacht and the casual egalitarianism of the American GI. And ultimately, it is the contrast between the lies of a totalitarian regime and the undeniable truth of a free society, served up on a metal tray in a mess hall in Alabama. As we continue this narrative in the next part, we will delve into the daily life of the camps, the strange and often humorous interactions between the prisoners and the local American populations, the University of the Barbed Wire, where prisoners educated themselves, and the secret war for the soul of the German soldier fought between the Nazi hardliners and the American re-education officers. This introduction to the American captivity was only the beginning. The true transformation of these men was about to take place in the cotton fields, the corn rows, and the canning factories of a nation they had sworn to destroy. The bugle call shattered the stillness of the dawn, echoing off the wooden barracks and rolling across the flat plains of Oklahoma. It was 5:30 a.m. In 1,000 camps across the United States, hundreds of thousands of men stirred from their sleep. They threw off their wool blankets that were stamped with the U.S. insignia, and swung their feet onto the wooden floorboards. The routine was military, precise, and familiar. But the context was entirely alien. As Hans, our representative German soldier, splashed cold water on his face in the communal washroom, he wasn't preparing to march into the burning sands of Libya or the frozen wastes of Russia. He was preparing to march into an American dining hall for a breakfast of eggs, bacon, oatmeal, and coffee, before heading out to harvest peanuts for a farmer named Smith. This settled reality, the day-to-day existence of the German prisoner of war in America, is where the true complexity of their story lies. Once the initial shock of the voyage and the abundance of food had faded, a new normality set in. The camps were not just holding pens, they were functioning cities, complete with their own economies, politics, prejudices, and cultures. And for the United States government, these men represented a critical asset. With millions of American men fighting overseas, the domestic labor shortage was catastrophic. Crops were rotting in the fields because there was no one to harvest them. The solution was obvious, yet sensitive. The enemy would save the American harvest. As we explore the fascinating world of the labor camps and the secret war fought inside the barracks, remember to subscribe to the channel. The stories of these men and their interactions with American civilians are a forgotten chapter of the war that shaped the future of relations between the two countries. The life of a POW was governed by the Geneva Convention, a document the United States adhered to with almost religious fervor. This meant that officers could not be forced to work, but non-commissioned officers and enlisted men could. However, the Americans quickly realized that forced labor is rarely efficient labor. Instead, they incentivized it. Prisoners were paid for their work. They received 80 cents a day in canteen coupons, scrip, which was roughly equivalent to the pay of an American private at the time. This, combined with the 10 cents a day they received just for being prisoners, gave them purchasing power. For a German soldier who had seen the Reichsmark crumble and inflation destroy savings, the ability to earn and spend was intoxicating. The camp canteens, or PX, were stocked with goods that were unavailable even to civilians in Germany. With their earnings, prisoners could buy beer, tobacco, toiletries, writing paper, and, incredibly, chocolate. The canteen was the heart of the camp's economic life, a place where the benefits of capitalism were on full display. But the real transformation happened outside the wire. Every morning, trucks would line up at the camp gates. Farmers, factory owners, and small business owners would arrive to pick up their allocated details of prisoners. The guards would accompany them, but as time went on and trust was established, the ratio of guards to prisoners decreased. The interaction between the German prisoners and the American farmers is one of the most human and touching aspects of this history. Imagine a farmer in rural Kansas. His sons are in the Pacific fighting the Japanese. He is left alone with hundreds of acres of wheat and no help. He is told that the government is sending him 10 German soldiers, Nazis, the enemy. He expects monsters. He expects fanatics who will sabotage his machinery or slit his throat. Instead, 10 young men climb out of a truck. They are tanned, fit, and shirtless in the heat. They look like farm boys from anywhere in the world. Many of them were farm boys. They looked at the tractors and the combines not with hatred, but with professional curiosity. The German affinity for machinery and engineering often took over. There are countless recorded instances where prisoners, seeing a broken thresher or a stalled tractor, would wave the farmer aside, dismantle the engine, fix the problem with improvised tools, and get it running again within the hour. The universal language of mechanics bridged the gap between enemy nations. The work was hard. They picked cotton in the blistering heat of Mississippi, harvested sugar beets in the winds of Colorado, and canned tomatoes in Indiana. But they worked with a discipline that impressed their employers. They marched to the field singing German marching songs, their voices harmonizing in a way that startled and fascinated the locals. The lunch break became the theater of fraternization. Officially, prisoners were not supposed to mix socially with civilians. They were supposed to eat their army rations separately. But out in the vast fields, far from the eyes of the camp commander, the rules dissolved. The American farmer, seeing these young men working hard to save his livelihood, would often invite them to the porch or even into the kitchen. The farmer's wife would cook a meal: fried chicken, corn on the cob, apple pie. The prisoners would sit at the table, initially stiff and polite. They would show photos of their families back in Hamburg or Bavaria. The farmer would show photos of his sons in uniform. A strange, melancholy bond formed. They were fathers and sons caught in a global tragedy, sharing a meal while the war raged thousands of miles away. These interactions shattered the propaganda on both sides. The Germans realized that Americans were not cultureless gangsters, but hard-working, religious, and family-oriented people. The Americans realized that the Germans were not all heel-clicking monsters, but polite, industrious young men who missed their mothers. In the cotton fields of the South, another layer of complexity was added. German prisoners often worked alongside African-American laborers. The Germans, coming from a racially homogeneous society and indoctrinated with Nazi racial theories, were confused by the segregation they witnessed in the land of the free. They saw that they, the white enemy, were often treated with more respect and allowed into spaces that the black American citizens were denied. This paradox was not lost on the African-American community either, who watched as German POWs were sometimes served at lunch counters where black soldiers were refused service. It was a bitter irony that highlighted the deep contradictions of American society at the time. However, life inside the camps was not all harmony and apple pie. While the days were filled with labor, the nights were often filled with fear. A secret war was being fought within the barracks, a war for the political soul of the prisoners. The camps were internally run by the prisoners themselves. The highest-ranking German NCOs were in charge of discipline and organization. In many camps, these leaders were hardcore Nazis, men who believed that the war was still winnable and that their captivity was just a temporary setback. They established a reign of terror to maintain ideological purity. They formed what became known as the Lager Gestapo, Camp Gestapo, or Holy Ghost. They monitored the other prisoners for any sign of defeatism or disloyalty. If a prisoner spoke too favorably about the Americans, or if he expressed doubt about Hitler's final victory, he would be marked. The punishment could range from social ostracism and the denial of choice work assignments to physical beatings in the middle of the night. In the most extreme cases, the Nazi hardliners conducted kangaroo courts, or Femi trials. These were secret tribunals held in the dead of night, in the latrines or the back of a barrack. The accused would be dragged from his bunk, charged with treason, and sentenced. The sentence was sometimes death. There were dozens of recorded murders in the camps. Prisoners were found hanging in the showers, staged to look like suicides. Others were beaten to death with lead pipes wrapped in towels to leave no marks. In one infamous case at Camp Concordia, a captain was found hanging after he had been seen cooperating too enthusiastically with American officers. The message was clear. The Third Reich is watching you, even in Kansas. The American authorities were initially slow to react to this. They adhered to the Geneva Convention, which stipulated that prisoners should be disciplined by their own officers. They also didn't want to disrupt the efficient running of the camps by interfering in internal German politics. As long as the prisoners showed up for roll call and did their work, the Americans turned a blind eye. It took time for the U.S. intelligence officers to realize the extent of the terror and to start segregating the fanatical Nazis from the anti-Nazi or apolitical soldiers. This eventually led to the creation of special camps for the hard cases, isolating the toxic influence of the die-hard fascists. Despite this undercurrent of fear, the majority of prisoners tried to make the best of their time. They engaged in a cultural flourishing that was nothing short of miraculous. They called it the University of the Barbed Wire. With their earnings and with donations from the YMCA and the Red Cross, the prisoners built libraries that rivaled those of small American towns. They ordered books on every subject imaginable, except, of course, anti-Nazi literature, which was initially banned by their own internal leadership. They organized schools, teaching each other everything from English and Spanish to advanced mathematics, engineering, and law. Professors who had been drafted into the army as privates now lectured to hundreds of eager students in mess halls, turned into lecture theaters. The artistic output was staggering. Every camp had an orchestra, often multiple. They bought instruments from the Sears and Roebuck catalog: violins, cellos, trumpets, pianos. They performed Beethoven, Mozart, and Wagner, but also American jazz, which was technically forbidden in Germany as degenerate music, but was embraced by the prisoners in the freedom of the camps. Theater troupes were formed. They built elaborate sets using scrap wood and fabric. Since there were no women in the camps, young soldiers took on female roles. They took this incredibly seriously, sewing costumes, styling wigs, and learning to walk and talk with feminine grace. These were not mockery or drag shows in the modern sense. They were serious attempts to recreate the plays of Goethe, or Schiller, or popular operettas. The leading ladies of the camp theater became minor celebrities within the wire, admired for their acting skill. Art classes produced thousands of paintings and sculptures. They painted the American landscapes they saw from the trucks, the sunsets over the desert, the snow on the Rockies. They carved wood and stone. Some of this art still remains today in local museums near the old campsites, a testament to the creative spirit that survived captivity. The camps also had their own newspapers. These publications were a mix of camp news, sports results, soccer leagues were passionately followed, poetry, and humor. They were subject to censorship by both the Americans and the internal German leadership, so they often walked a fine line. But they provided a crucial outlet for expression. One of the most surreal aspects of camp life was the ability to send care packages home. As the war turned against Germany, the situation for civilians back home became desperate. Cities were being bombed into rubble, and food was scarce. In a complete reversal of the expected order, the prisoners in America began sending food, coffee, and cigarettes to their families in Germany. A mother in a bombed-out basement in Cologne might receive a package from her son in Texas containing American chocolate, coffee beans, and soap. It was a lifeline that further undermined the Nazi propaganda. How could the Americans be fiends if they allowed prisoners to feed their families? As 1944 dragged into 1945, the atmosphere in the camps began to shift. The news from the front could no longer be suppressed or spun. The invasion of Normandy, the liberation of Paris, the crossing of the Rhine. The American camp commanders began to play newsreels in the camp cinemas. Initially, the Nazi hardliners ordered their men to boo and jeer, claiming the footage was faked by Hollywood. They would shout, "Lies, lies," when images of German defeats were shown. But as the footage became more undeniable, miles of German prisoners, recognizable German cities in ruins, the shouting stopped. A sullen silence descended on the mess halls. The cognitive dissonance was breaking. The miracle weapons promised by Hitler, the V-1 and V-2 rockets, had not turned the tide. The reality of defeat was approaching. The American government launched a formal re-education program, officially called the Intellectual Diversion Program. The goal was to denazify the prisoners and prepare them to build a democratic Germany after the war. They introduced books that had been banned by the Nazis: Thomas Mann, Heinrich Heine, and works on American democracy. They showed films documenting the concentration camps. This was the most volatile moment. When the films of the liberation of Buchenwald and Dachau were shown, many prisoners reacted with denial. They claimed it was a trick, a set made with wax figures or starving Indians. They could not believe, or refused to believe, that their nation was capable of such industrial slaughter. But for others, the undeniable horror on the screen was the final shattering of their worldview. Weeping was heard in the dark theater halls. Men stumbled out into the sunlight, vomiting or shaking, their moral universe in collapse. The daily life in the camps was a strange purgatory. It was a place of comfort and plenty, yet a place of confinement. It was a place where a man could learn to play the cello or study law, while fearing a beating from his own comrades. It was a place where he could eat a steak dinner while his family starved, and where he could harvest crops for the enemy while his own country burned. The experience of the German POWs in America was a massive, unintended sociological experiment. What happens when you take men raised in a totalitarian pressure cooker and release them into a land of abundance and relative freedom, yet keep them behind barbed wire? The answer was a complex transformation. They were becoming something new, not quite American, but no longer the soldiers of the Third Reich who had marched into Poland and France. They were men in transition, waiting for a world that was being born in fire and blood across the ocean. The labor they provided was immense. By the end of the war, German POWs had saved millions of tons of crops. They had become a vital part of the American wartime economy, but they had also left a mark on the American psyche. The people who had met them, worked with them, and fed them had learned that the enemy was human. And the prisoners had learned that the degenerate democracy was a powerhouse of production and, more importantly, a society that could treat its captives with dignity. As the war in Europe drew to a close, the question of what next hung heavy in the air. The Third Reich was dying. The camps were buzzing with anxiety. Would they be sent home? To what home? Was there anything left of Germany? Or would they be kept as slave labor to rebuild the Europe they had helped destroy? The comfort of the American camps began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a waiting room for a harsh judgment day. In the final part of our series, we will explore the end of the war, the chaotic and often bitter process of repatriation, the lost years in Britain and France for many, and the lasting legacy of this incredible historical episode. We will hear the stories of those who returned to a ruined Germany with a taste for peanut butter and democracy, and the few who managed to return to the United States to become citizens of the land that had once been their prison. On May 8, 1945, a strange silence fell over the prisoner of war camps scattered across the United States. The radios, which usually buzzed with music and news, delivered the final crushing announcement. The Third Reich had surrendered unconditionally. For the men behind the wire, the war was over. There was no cheering. There was only a profound, heavy uncertainty. For years they had lived in a suspended reality, fed, clothed, and sheltered by the enemy, while their homeland was reduced to ash. Now, the bubble was about to burst. The immediate aftermath of the surrender was not the joyful homecoming many prisoners had naively expected. Instead, the atmosphere in the camps turned cold. As Allied troops liberated the concentration camps in Europe, the full scale of the Nazi atrocities was revealed to the world. The images of Bergen-Belsen and Dachau were splashed across American newspapers. The curiosity and friendliness of the American public turned to horror and revulsion. The polite farm boys were now seen as representatives of a monstrous regime. The golden age of the POW camps ended overnight. The generous rations that had shocked the prisoners in 1943 were drastically cut. The U.S. government adopted a new policy. Prisoners should not eat better than the starving civilians in liberated Europe. The days of steaks and milk were gone. In their place came meager stews and strict calorie counting. The canteen privileges were revoked. The friendly chats with guards ceased. The Americans pulled back, erecting a wall of icy professionalism. Then came the repatriation process, which proved to be the final bitter twist in their American odyssey. Most prisoners believed that with the war over, they would be put on ships and sent directly back to their families in Germany. They packed their bags, carefully stowing the small treasures they had acquired: American cigarettes, nylon stockings for their wives, and the money they had saved from their labor. They were loaded onto ships, watching the Statue of Liberty fade into the distance once more. But as the coastline of Europe came into view, they realized they were not heading for Hamburg or Bremen. Many ships docked in Liverpool, England, or Le Havre, France. The United States, facing immense pressure from its allies, had agreed to transfer hundreds of thousands of German prisoners to Britain and France to help rebuild the shattered infrastructure of the continent. For many, this was a devastating blow. They had survived the war and the golden cage of America, only to be handed over to the French, who, understandably, held a deep and burning resentment toward the Germans. The conditions in the French camps were a stark contrast to the heated barracks of Texas. Food was scarce, disease was rampant, and the work was dangerous. Many former American POWs found themselves clearing minefields with their bare hands, or rebuilding cities brick by brick. These were the lost years, a time of hardship that stood in grueling contrast to their time in the U.S. It wasn't until 1947 and 1948 that the bulk of these men finally crossed the border into Germany. The homecoming was a surreal experience. They returned to a lunar landscape of ruins. Their cities were gone, their homes were piles of rubble, and their families were often living in cellars, gaunt and starving. The returning soldiers stood out. Despite the recent hardships in France, those coming from America were often still healthier, taller, and more energetic than the gray, beaten-down population of post-war Germany. They brought with them strange new habits. They chewed gum. They used American slang like okay and take it easy. They spoke fondly of a land that the average German still viewed through the lens of wartime propaganda. These returnees became a unique demographic in the new West Germany. They were the Texas Germans or the Kansas boys. They had seen democracy in action, not just as a political concept, but as a daily reality where a man could argue with his boss and not be arrested. They had seen an economy built on mass production and consumerism. In the ruined lecture halls of German universities and the smoke-filled back rooms of new political parties, these men became quiet ambassadors for a new way of life. When the United States launched the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, these former prisoners were the perfect bridge. They understood the Americans. They knew how to work with American machinery, how to negotiate with American officers, and how to interpret the American mindset to their skeptical countrymen. They became the managers, the translators, and the local leaders who helped facilitate the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of the 1950s. But the human legacy was perhaps the most profound. Years later, as travel became possible again, a strange phenomenon occurred. Former Wehrmacht soldiers began to book vacations to the United States. They didn't go to see the sights of New York or Hollywood. They rented cars and drove into the rural heartland, to Alabama, to Oklahoma, to Wisconsin. They were looking for the farms where they had picked cotton. They were looking for the families who had invited them to Thanksgiving dinner in 1944. There are incredibly moving stories of elderly American farmers opening their doors to find a gray-haired German man standing on the porch, tears in his eyes, holding a bottle of wine. The reunions were emotional. The barriers of war had been dissolved by the shared humanity of those strange years behind the wire. Some did more than just visit. Thousands of former POWs eventually emigrated to the United States, becoming citizens of the country that had once held them captive. They became bakers in Chicago, engineers in Detroit, and farmers in the Midwest. They raised American children, their pasts as soldiers of the Third Reich slowly fading into history, replaced by the identity of the immigrant who found a second chance. The story of the German POWs in America is a testament to the power of soft power. The United States did not just defeat these men on the battlefield. It defeated their ideology by showing them a better alternative. It proved that a democracy, chaotic and noisy as it might be, could provide a dignity and prosperity that a dictatorship never could. In the end, the greatest victory wasn't won with tanks or bombs. It was won with white bread, fair treatment, and the realization that even in the midst of total war, humanity can survive. These men came as enemies, left as prisoners, and returned as the builders of a peaceful, democratic Europe. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through one of the most fascinating yet often overlooked chapters of World War II. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history and want to support our work, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. We have many more untold stories waiting to be discovered. See you next time.